what I was hoping we could talk about today was kind of the food system shock that nobody was covering initially. And the reason I say that is when what was interesting for us, and still today, right, is a lot of the coverage we see is very energy dependent, oil especially, and natural gas, and was almost exclusively energy dependent at the beginning of the crisis. This is really the story of two particular shocks, right? And so on the left-hand side, obviously, that's the Strait of Hormuz, February 28th, when the beginning of the attacks on Iran happened, that basically shut down, right? But from a fertilizer perspective, 30 to 50% of the world's urea goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And so that was kind of the beginning of the crisis on the 28th. And then on March 18th, what you're seeing there in the picture were the missile attacks on the Ras Laffan plant in Qatar. And so initial estimates, and we haven't seen them change necessarily, was that 17 to 18% of total production in Ras Laffan was basically taken out by the missiles. Obviously, the plant has been shut down since the beginning of the conflict. 10 to 14% of the global urea market comes out of Qatar. The Gulf hubs produce 50% of total sulfur, which is a key ingredient in overall phosphate. And so we always need to remember 18% of that capacity is out, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, even if everything went back to normal today. The United States produces 75% of the fertilizer it uses domestically. And so the impacts, right, the prices have gone up of certain things. Obviously, fertilizer, we'll talk about that, obviously diesel. But generally, in terms of the planting, most farmers in the Northern Hemisphere had pre-purchased it. And so we've seen U.S. corn, soy crop largely unaffected. What we worry about, right, is more of the Southern Hemisphere, Brazil, Argentina, Southeast Asia, right? And I think a lot of the conversation here, and we'd love to hear from you, is this really is for many folks almost an Asian crisis from a fuel perspective, but from our side, especially from a fertilizer perspective. And part of it is because they are forced today to start to buy the fertilizer that they would for the planting that will occur later on. And so you have that immediate exposure to disruption in Arab prices. The impact is likely severe. Some analysis we did in Myanmar, we're seeing 60% plus increase in input costs. Brazil's June and August buying window aligns exactly with the disruption period. There's 3 things that have to occur before we get back to normal, right? To a state before, again, let's just assume Iran and the United States come to an agreement, everybody abides by it, we're good. They say we're going to reopen the Strait. You have to demine the Strait first. Iran has already said publicly that they do not remember all of the places where they put mines. And so that's going to be a real undertaking. Number 2, Lloyd's, you have to have insurance rates go back down so that it becomes economic again to start transporting through the Strait of Hormuz. And then 3, you have to have captains who are crazy enough to start transporting their ships again through the Strait of Hormuz. And so even after the demining happens, insurance rates go back down, that it becomes economic, you have enough captains who are willing to transit the Strait, the first thing that you're going to start transporting isn't going to be fertilizer, it's going to be oil. Because our baseline understanding is even if you have a cessation of hostilities tomorrow, you're probably not going to get more fertilizer out of the region this year. It's 3 shocks that are happening all at once. One is the energy and logistics shock, which we've talked about. And you're seeing it from a diesel perspective, refrigerated freight. That's already underway. That's really the only part that's hitting, I would say, the United States right now, but obviously having much broader implications globally. 2, what we consider starting in Q3, the Southern Hemisphere input squeeze. And so you're seeing South American, Southeast Asian farmers purchasing these inputs right in the middle of the disruption window. That's where you start to see, are you starting to plant different types of crops that are less fertilizer intensive? Are you planting crops that, are you putting in less fertilizer into your crops? Either way, the expectation is, 1, you're going to have lower production overall of the crops that are very intensive from a fertilizer perspective. You also expect lower yields generally because your input costs are so high. And then the last point is you continue to have what we call structural pressure. And so this is something we really, really worry about in kind of early 2027, if not longer. So if you have initially, like, your input costs are becoming more expensive, but generally the Northern Hemisphere had already bought everything they needed. And so you have kind of higher prices starting to flow through. Now that you are doing the pre-buying in the Southern Hemisphere, you're starting to make those trade-offs. And so if we assume and we know that your production and yield is going to be lower, by 2027, what does that mean? You're going to start to put a lot of pressure on your existing stocks and grain stocks, which are, I mean, if you're China, they've done a really good job of building that up. If you're India, you have not. What we really worry about is there is a real distinction that I think is important to keep in our minds. A price shock versus a physical unavailability shock is what we call it. What we're seeing right now in many parts is you are still getting some of the inputs that you need, right? You're still able to buy, whether it's the inputs or, you know, your outputs around, you know, maize, soy, you know, wheat, obviously, and we can talk about that in a second, sorghum, etc. It's just a lot more expensive than it used to be. At some point in the crisis, you're going to move away from this just being a price shock to what we call a physical unavailability shock. And that means you are not able to get that particular commodity at any price. To make things worse, El Nino arrives. We've been hearing a lot of a super El Nino. Again, we're tracking it. What's interesting about El Nino is it impacts countries very, very differently. And so in some countries, it increases drought pretty significantly. In some countries, it increases flooding pretty significantly, and it impacts crops very, very differently. We do a lot of work in Thailand on pineapple. That's a very different impact than you would have in corn or soy in Brazil, as an example. So in Brazil, obviously, what we're focused on is soy and corn, and MENA, wheat and grains, right? And then obviously in the south, we have rice and palm oil. And it is across each of these, what we're seeing is almost a triple overlap, right? You have the climate issues, fertilizer issues, export revenue risk, or import dependency, or currency risk. At any point, we spend a ton of time with farmers, large and small. I think farming is probably the hardest, most optimistic job you have to have in the world. If everything is perfect, right? Your weather is perfect, your input costs are low, your harvest worked out really well, you make a few percentage points. If anything goes wrong, you lose money. Given everything that's going on, we don't see how the vast majority of farms don't lose money, especially smallholder farmers over the next year or so. We just wanted to look at the two most recent food crises. One is the 07-08 price shock, right? The trigger was drought and biofuel demand and export bans. The wheat price increased pretty dramatically, right? I think the World Bank put this figure at 120% plus. Fertilizer was 200% plus. 105 million people were pushed into poverty. Food riots occurred in 37 countries. It will soon become a geopolitical crisis as well. We don't know how much worse it's likely to be, but we know it's compounding an already elevated and undernourished baseline of folks. And so what we're seeing is here it's a combination of both a logistics shock and a price shock that is likely to turn into an availability shock. The three things I think we're hearing is, one, as much as possible, try and pre-position inputs, right? We don't think the prices are going to go down necessarily. So as much as you can, help folks bulk purchase, urea, DAP, negotiate volume contracts now if you can. Better to have a price shock than an availability concern. Two, as much as possible, unlock smallholder credit. There's a lot of issues with farm financing, but now is the time, I think, to push, especially agricultural lending, as hard as humanly possible to try and create that working capital. And then three, right, and this is where I think this type of forum is so helpful. Continue to share ground level signals. I think this is a really helpful way to get that early warning system and both share what folks are seeing on the ground and what's working.